All right, guys, this is Luke Johnson and
CJ. Hello.
yeah, and we're from the Philosophy Humanities teaching app Noetic, and today we're going to be talking about Soren Kierkegaard's On the Difference Between a Genius and an Apostle. Somewhat of an overlooked work, but definitely one that was incredibly essential to our understanding of the Kierkegaardian theory in general. At least that's what we were discussing off mic earlier. I have a little bit of background information that I'd want to convey about it, but I think before I launch into that, I maybe would just cede the floor to you, CJ. Is there anything in particular you wanted to say before we got started?
Well, I think what's really fascinating about this work, I think we were talking before this, how Kierkegaard seems to have one big idea. If you use the analogy of the hedgehog and the fox, where the hedgehog has one big idea, Kierkegaard definitely has one big idea, as we will see. But what I found fascinating reading his works is that he's almost like the fox who knows many ideas. And it's interesting how he combines the fox and the hedgehog in that way. He has one big idea, but then he takes it and we look at it through different angles. The present age was one angle, fear and trembling is going to be another, and of the difference between a genius and an apostle is going to be another one as well. But it's in a way that isn't so much like he's beating a dead horse. It's almost like we're looking at different angles of a sculpture.
Yeah.
We're getting really in close, then we're getting afar, then we're actually getting a light cast on it, so the shadow brings out a different feature. But within all of that, we get a bigger sense of that one idea. And it's not really one-dimensional. I think I was telling you before that it almost becomes a three-dimensional sculpture. I mean, he has 80 works, correct? So all of them, in a sense, are a different angle. We almost get an 80-dimensional
Yeah, if you wanted to really understand,
idea.
if you really wanted to understand Kierkegaard's one big idea, which I guess would be the existential theory of the individual, the person, the subject, whatever you want to say, a stable sort of conception of what that theory is if you read all 80 books and sort of do that. So there's really a great utility in going through the books like we're doing. And I sort of analogize what you're talking about earlier to Darwin's theory of of evolution. Darwin really had one big idea, but yet it can be looked at from so many different angles and so many different contexts. We were speaking off mic earlier, how I was saying it can be looked at not only biologically, but on the micro and macro levels. And does it apply in the same way on those different levels? It can be looked at from a social perspective. It can be looked at through digital technology. It can be looked at cosmically. We talk about galaxies and things and stars and things like that evolving. So inanimate matter evolving. So I think what we're talking about similarly here with Kierkegaard is that we're just looking at it through different sets of eyes. But there's generally one cohesive theory or doctrine that kind of binds it all together.
And what I find fascinating, at least for me, and I don't know if this is the same for you, but oftentimes we can be dismissive of somebody that's just beating, we call it beating a dead horse, correct? Where we say, oh, they're just saying the same thing through their whole corpus, or they're just rehashing the same idea in a different book, in a different book, in a different book. But it's not as easy as that.
Well, it's something that we've talked about earlier about the different types of infinity. There's in a sense, like what we're going to be doing at Noetic is limitless and infinite because we can expand in so many different directions and cover so many books and so many ideas. But then within a limit, there's an infinity there, right? There's a constrained infinity between the numbers 1 and 2. And I think as we look at the constrained infinity that is Kierkegaard's first and second authorship, or his entire authorship in general, we're going to find that there's an infinity of ideas there. It may on the outside look rather narrow.
Exactly.
So, but then I think you have to ask yourself, what's, and perhaps this is a little bit of a digression. We have to ask ourselves, what is so fascinating about a constrained infinity? I think there's something that's awe-inspiring about thinking about a limitless universe or a limitless pool of ideas or something like that. But what's so fascinating about the infinity contained within something constrained?
Well, what I find fascinating for me And again, I've said that again, so I guess I'm going to just, everything's fascinating to me, I
Yeah.
think, at this point. But Daniel C. Dennett has a really interesting phrase he calls vast numbers, where he says, okay, it seems limitless, but there's a limit to it. It's just such a big number that we can't exactly, if we tried to count that, we might be dead umpteen fold before we actually count all of the variations of that thing.
So
and that could be with an authorship, that could be with the human
does it intrigue
genome, species, anything like that.
So does it intrigue you to perhaps stumble upon the limit of what seems limitless?
What do you think the limit? What do you mean by the limit? As in, we actually find
like how far Kierkegaard can really take this idea?
Well, are we ever going to get to that limit? That's
I certainly haven't gotten there yet. I don't know, but I think that's part of the fun, right? To see if you can run out of tricks, right?
I think that's the interesting thing about philosophy, or the really cool thing about it, is that we've been talking about Socrates and Plato. I mean, if we want to go back to antiquity, for such a long time, and we're still talking about Kierkegaard after what, maybe 100 years. We're almost on his bicentennial, maybe. I'm not really sure, but we're still talking about them. It just might be that vast number where there are maybe a limited ways of looking at it, but we are never going to exhaust that in our lifetimes, or maybe in the longer span of a lifetime.
By the way, Kierkegaard was born, I believe, 203 years ago.
Perfect. So we've hit his bicentennial and some change.
Yes, I think he was born in 1813. I think that's right. And and I think he died in the 1850s. I don't know the exact date that he died, or I don't know the exact year. But his bicentennial of his birth was in 2013.
Well, 200 years isn't a long time, but I mean, we're still talking about him, which is quite amazing.
Yeah. Well, let's get into a little bit of the biographical information of this one. I mean, look, we could probably be talking about what's so fascinating about constrained infinities the entire time, but let's get into on the difference between a genius and an apostle. So far as I know, I haven't been able to find any sort of audio materials on this. So once again, we're doing a little bit of innovation, which puts a little bit of pressure on us. We're the first, but hopefully others will surpass us and do an even better job one day. So we're just going to kind of do an intro and a comprehensive overview of this, and maybe we'll go back and rehearse some of the finer details one day. So what I want to say about this is that this falls under the category of, it's one of Kierkegaard's two major ethical religious essays. All right. And what's interesting about this, it was written in 1849, and typically things post 1846 are put into the category of Soren Kierkegaard's second authorship, which is stuff he was generally religious and he directly signed. Typically, the things that are more theological or religious, Kierkegaard was more interested in putting his name to. But what's strange about this book is that he uses a pseudonym.
And what is that?
He uses the pseudonym HH. And there are only two occasions, I believe, someone might want to correct me on this, but there are only two occasions in the second authorship, which is primarily religious, where he uses pseudonyms. HH in this, on the difference between a genius and an apostle, and then on the sickness unto death, that he attributes that writing to Anticlimacus, but Soren Kierkegaard is listed as the editor or publisher of the book. And I was talking to my friend Matt today, a little shout out to Matt Brake. The reason why he believes that Soren Kierkegaard in the sickness unto death was merely the editor of the book and not the author of that book is that Kierkegaard himself did not think he really had reached the religious level of Anticlimacus. That's why he passed it on to a pseudonym. So whether or not that was true or not, well, that's a topic for another day. But an interesting question is, what's the difference between HH and Anticlimacus? Because HH definitely seems to be someone who believes in the gospel and in Jesus Christ in this, and so does Anticlimacus in the sickness unto death. So I think an interesting question for scholars is, why did Kierkegaard employ different pseudonyms to talk about essentially the same thing?
A pseudonym used in a sense of humility, that is quite profound in the sense that he felt that he didn't reach that point yet. Isn't that what we talked about last time too? That he didn't exactly say, or maybe this was off camera, he didn't exactly say he was a Christian per se, but he still writes about it.
Yeah, and this is the thing, is that Kierkegaard didn't really think you arrive at a state of Christian, that you are constantly striving into becoming one. There's never a frozen sort of status. You constantly have to reappropriate the relationship with Jesus Christ. It's not like you get baptized and you're a Christian,
So
or
are
you're
these
born into
pseudonyms-
Denmark and you're a Christian.
So are these pseudonyms then pilgrims in progress, just like Kierkegaard was?
I think they represent fractions of himself, and and probably depending on the hour of the day, he was tempted back into lower existence spheres. So maybe when he published this book, he didn't feel like he was being particularly Christian. But then when he did like works of love, he's like, yeah, I'm going through a real Christian phase right now. But maybe the fact that the pseudonyms persist show that he was liable to lapse into pre-existing existence stages, just like all of us.
This is going to get very complicated when maybe the question I'm thinking about right now is whether someone can be a genius while still being an apostle at the same time, or being an apostle but using the genius.
I think Kierkegaard did. I think Kierkegaard was a genius and an apostle.
We'll see if he addresses that in the book.
Yeah.
But that's
a
question I had off of that.
So we should probably jump right into it. I've got a bunch of terms, but I think we'll define those as we go along.
For sure.
To get this book started, Kierkegaard talks about how philosophy has really messed with Christianity. How do you understand his ruminations on how philosophy has messed with Christianity?
Well, I think before we get into that, I think we need to touch on the aesthetic viewpoint of Christianity, or at least that's what Kierkegaard, I think, thinks is messing with Christianity.
They're one and the same, because and this is so Kierkegaard, trying to understand what it means for the aesthetic to mess with Christianity, presupposes that we have a good understanding of what the aesthetic is. And I think my question about how philosophy has messed with Christianity sort of falls under that. It's hard to say exactly what Kierkegaard means by the aesthetic, but typically the way that I understand the aesthetic is that the aesthetic is like anything that's sort of like pleasurable, that sort of distracts us from our sort of essential life commitments. And sometimes that can be like sex. It can be something very bestial, like gluttony or greed, but it can also be something really high-minded, such as philosophy. It's my belief that if one is so absorbed in philosophy that you fail to actualize ethically or religiously, then philosophy is a seductive tool of the aesthetic. And I think Kierkegaard may have viewed it in the same way and kind of thinks of the genius as possibly within the realm of the aesthetic.
So then what we can surmise from that is that philosophy takes away from to use a word that he's going to insult aesthetics and philosophy with, it takes away the profundity of the relationship between a person and said religion, in the sense that it explains away what we're going to define later, the paradoxical relationship.
Yeah, it's hard.
Is that
to
a
say.
way to explain it?
I think you would. I think maybe that might be slightly unhelpful, because the thing is that Christianity is not going to be profound in the sense that it's not going to be a clever doctrine. And I think the problem is that, right. So Christianity, and by the way, he also the way that he understands Christianity is that it's the paradoxical religion. And the reason why Christianity is the paradoxical religion, and he doesn't explicitly say that here, is like in places like Philosophical Fragments and whatnot, the reason why Christianity is the paradoxical religion is that it's all predicated on the fact that God became man, and that the infinite is simultaneously finite, and that this is a paradox that thought cannot resolve. But going back to our conversation on the present age, Kierkegaard believes at this time in Copenhagen, people are either they trust Hegel so much or so steeped in the philosophical systematizing nature of Hegelian thought that they believe this absolute paradox, which is at the center of Christianity, has been made sane and rational and something that can be understood. And I think what he's concerned about, if Christianity is a thought is a thought system that the smartest people can have access to, is that it makes it less rigorous. It makes it something that it cheapens it, and it reduces it to an aesthetic category, so that Christianity is something that is to be admired for the works of art that it produces, or the profundity of the sermon, or the churches that are built around it. But the essential thing at its core, because it's now it can now be comprehended, means less and less to people. And what he's going to try to do here and other places is to make the paradox of Christianity truly what it is, totally absurd, and to problematize it even more so people don't get caught up in the trappings of philosophy and the aesthetics of the church and gossip and the press and all these other things, but constantly keep the paradox of Christ before them.
Thank you for clearing that up, because I think that is something even today, if we're going to talk about the current use or why we should care about this text. I mean, I just went right into it and said, oh, the profundity of the relationship between one and God. I think it's something that we've all kind of taken for granted, and I think was what Kierkegaard is pointing at and saying, hey, this isn't really what it's about. I mean, if we think of even a contemporary Kierkegaard, Thomas Jefferson, his version of the Bible,
the Jeffersonian Bible, is just to cut out all the miraculous parts.
Cut out the miraculous part and keep the sermons, keep the parables, keep the profound words, if we're going to use that term, keep the teachings. So he's not really concerned about, would we say maybe he's more concerned about Jesus as a genius rather than a quote unquote apostle, or rather than God as man, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is that he wants to restore it. If Christianity can all be reduced to a systematic thoughts philosophy, is that then every speaker, everyone who's announcing Christianity is some sort of really educated genius. And he wants to make the case that you don't have to be a hyper profound person to communicate the truth of Christianity. Christ himself was not a philosopher. Christ himself was not opining about a philosophical system. Christ was saying, I'm God. There is an eternal life. I'm not really going to argue for these things. I'm just going to assert them. Christ didn't go and philosophically, rigorously debate these issues. I mean, there's stories about him in the temples when he was a juvenile and stuff like that.
But later, we have people like, say, Thomas Aquinas, who to me is almost like a chess player, especially when you look at a Summa Theologica or any of his works, where he kind of gives, or he does give proofs of God, and then gives counterproofs, and then gives counterproofs to those proofs. It's almost like he's playing chess with these things that Kierkegaard said you should just take it as it is, as this absurdity, and that's the point of faith.
Guess what Kierkegaard would say to all those chess maneuvers that people like Aquinas are doing? He would say that that's a seduction of philosophy. And to give into philosophy to try to prove God is to be tempted by a lower stage of existence.
So then the text that you're examining of Aquinas, I mean, not Aquinas, but of Augustine, would that be considered in that vein as well?
I mean, this is a really this is a really complicated question. I mean, because you could say too, right? Like Kierkegaard is using philosophy as well, right? So what extent can Kierkegaard say philosophy has its limits and it needs to be abandoned here? But then at the same time, he's using philosophy to establish these points of limits. And so, Kierkegaard may have a few things to say about where Augustine perhaps errs. I mean, possibly you could look at what Kierkegaard noticeably omits as not being worth a topic of conversation. Kierkegaard, as far as I know, and I haven't read all 80 books or whatever, doesn't spend a long time trying to figure out, where souls come from or proving God or anything like that. So I'm sure there are things that Kierkegaard would find in Augustine that he thought were a temptation away from the essential truth of Christianity.
So
but
now
I don't know where. Yeah. The only thing I can know directly that there's a departure of Kierkegaard from Augustine is on the fall. There's the Augustinian conception of the fall is more genetic in nature, something that's passed on as a result of just like being a part of the human species. And I think we'll have to look at this another day. And I believe it's covered in the concept of anxiety, but I'll have to recheck that. But the way that Kierkegaard imagines it is that every individual experiences a spiritual fall, and that people aren't necessarily born into sin. Don't quote me on any of that because I have to revisit it, but I think that is kind of, and I think that's probably the essential difference on Augustine and Kierkegaard if we care.
So we are outlining these tensions currently right now, and I think maybe we need to find, or at least jump into the human embodiments of this tension
Yeah.
between the philosophical and quote unquote true Christianity. So I don't know if you want to jump right into genius versus apostle.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, let's just use some embodiments of that, like you said. So he uses, what are some of the examples of genius that he uses?
Well, he uses Plato.
Yep.
We get Shakespeare.
And even St. Paul to a certain degree. But St. Paul, if St. Paul is recognized for his philosophical nimbleness, his poetic expression of the Christian truth, if Christianity is sort of normalized, if that's all that's attributed to St. Paul, something very essential has been missed. So, but in general, the genius, I have a little chart here that I've created, and that typically in understanding the genius versus the apostle, we have to think about the genius as someone that exists within the sphere of eminence. Okay. And we have to talk about what it means to live in the sphere of eminence, whereas the apostle tends to live in the sphere of the transcendent or the transcendental. So the sphere of eminence, how do you understand the sphere of eminence? It's kind of hard to say, and I don't know if I'll be able to say it entirely, but I want to see what impression it left on you.
The sphere of eminence to me revolves around something that is finite, in the sense that a genius might appear, if we're going to use the word paradox, might appear paradoxical, but is soon assimilated into the public, where it's not something where he can't always be paradoxical. There's some kind of
right, and we'll have to talk about why that
getting in the way, but I know that's just only one part of the immanence, but I think of it as something that is a finite thing, and that's maybe one layer of it. Maybe you can explore the other layers.
So let me take that a little bit. So to exist within sort of the eminental sphere for Kierkegaard, it seems like to me that is going to be something of thought. That's something that could be sort of followed by anyone if they've given a sort of enough reflection to it or whatever. So we could say that Socrates was an eminental sort of figure, right? In the sense that he was able to generate all this philosophical thought. And he, at the time, looked paradoxical to the public that he was within. Like, they ultimately put him to death because they couldn't understand him. But 3,000 years later, we understand Socrates perfectly. Eventually, his philosophical modes, he may have been so far ahead of the people at the time, but now at least we think we can understand him, because essentially he was tapping into something that's already within the race and gets assimilated into the race. Whereas the apostle possesses a paradoxical truth that can never be assimilated into the race. And that paradoxical truth is the truth of Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, specifically that he's this combination of God and man. And there's no amount of philosophical discernment or scrutability that will ever normalize that and will make that totally absorbed into the race. And Kierkegaard thinks that if people do come to accept that into the race, if that does become normalized by a Hegel, by art, by the authority of the church, by anything like that, then there's a problem. Kierkegaard wants to dramatize the offensiveness of the paradoxical element of Christianity, so it forever remains at odds with the culture. And then you have to ask yourself, why is it so important for the Christian truth to be offensive? And the reason why it's so essential for Kierkegaard is because it has to be something that you stake your life on. And when it can't be philosophically resolved or solved for you by an academic, you make a decision for it. And in the process of making a decision for it, you have your character, your person, your subject revolutionized in the commitment. So that would be how I would describe. And to be an apostle means not that you found the truth within philosophically, but the truth, the logos, the eternal truth has been brought to you from without. So you can't find it on your own within. Socrates couldn't find it, not only because he was trapped within philosophy, but because Christ hadn't incarnated yet. Had Christ lived, he may have become an apostle. In fact, Kierkegaard speculates in places that Socrates may have become a Christian, and maybe that's because, and just speculating here, maybe that has something to do with perhaps Christ's where Christ was in the 3 days prior to his resurrection.
So what I'm getting at from that is that there is some kind of interruption, that all of a sudden divine authority is placed on this person who is then going to be the apostle, in a sense, where a genius, like we said, eminence, I think what I get from it, from what you just said, is that it's something within, or as Kierkegaard says, genius is what it is of itself, i.e. through that which it is in itself. So something in the sense of, like you said, is just within himself. It's just thought, or maybe it's ecstasy of sex or anything like that. It's just carnal, or it can be of the mind, but it's still of themselves, and it's not this thing that is not given to him.
Right. Well, let's play that tension out a little bit more. So essentially, genius is you're born with it, right? Like you're an incredible guitar player, right? You were born with a proclivity or a genius to play that guitar, right? Or we know other individuals who have the genius of painting or for business or whatever else. Like everybody seems to have a little bit of that genius in them. Whether it fully goes cultivated, I don't know. Like for me, I always wanted to be known as a genius in music, but truthfully, that was sort of grafted onto my personality and was a result of industry. And I never really probably was a genius at music. This stuff I'm doing with philosophy, I've been doing this since I was like 4, man. Like this was in me at a very young age. Like I was like putting it to my Sunday school teachers when I was like 7 years old or whatever. And when I think about it, like this is probably the most essential aspect of myself. And maybe Kierkegaard doesn't say this, but maybe everybody has a genius in them in some respect, but I don't know. There's no divine authority to it. And it can only really be assessed aesthetically or philosophically. Whether or not I'm doing good philosophy right now is really for the community to decide. And right now, like maybe people think I suck at philosophy, but maybe like 300 years from now, maybe people think I'm good at philosophy. My authority is completely transitory and based on the world of perception.
So it either gets assimilated by how awesome it is, or it gets assimilated by obscurity, as in you are just kind of absorbed into the miasma of philosophy from everybody that's doing it.
Yeah, like we may be the most minor footnote in the history of philosophy one day, or we are sensationalized in some way and then normalized in a different way where people are like, oh yeah, they're the guys that did that thing, you know? And the difference, like the apostle has divine authority. They're not necessarily like philosophers. They're not called by reason, but they're called by God himself. Right. So, and this sets up some terms that we want to talk a little bit about. The genius has what Kierkegaard calls immanent teleology. And immanent teleology means just like you personally sort of developed this, like Prince wanted to go all the way that he could with his special genius or whatever. It had to sort of exhaust itself in the way that it did. Or like maybe our particular genius for reimagining philosophy in a digital age is our particular genius, and it will run its course as well. But the apostle has what Kierkegaard calls absolute paradoxical teleology. And so that means that the apostle is on a mission to deliver a message, and that telos comes from without. Like that's going to be that's going to be sort of the message of Jesus Christ. So when Jesus says there's an eternal life, or that you believe in me if you want to be saved or something like that, like so far as we have any sort of authority or whatever, it is traced back to the sayings and message of Jesus for Kierkegaard.
And I think maybe if we can use not Jesus, but just a normal guy, you know, like a St. Paul or maybe an Abraham, as you guys will explore in Fear and Trembling, it's this thing that there is nothing, I think he says, everyone is just as likely to be an apostle at any given moment as the next person. That it isn't something that, oh, well, I could tell little Billy was just going to be an apostle. I could just tell he had that potential. It's just something that happens at random, that
anyone can be called. But this is the interesting thing is like, if you're called, and this is a thing that I would love to ask Kierkegaard, if you're called, can you resist the call? Or if you hear the call, do you automatically submit to it? If anyone can be called, and you can't resist the call, then it seems like God favors some individuals over the others, and that you're not fully in control of your life, which goes against this existential philosophy of freedom that Kierkegaard is trying to promulgate. And maybe it doesn't matter because like we're talking about trying to understand freedom and cosmic calling on a metaphysical scheme. And Kierkegaard would say, look, your reason will never be able to scrutinize that. Give up on that endeavor. All that really matters is if you feel the freedom within as you make these decisions.
Though I wonder,
it's kind of a compatibilist view.
I wonder if maybe you're looking at one angle of that big idea and maybe you have to kind of look at another one, because maybe he does talk about that in the sense of Job and of Abraham, how even though they did accept the call, they had these moments where it just seemed like, gosh, why did I even take the red pill? You know what I mean? Or it's just like,
well, Jesus himself, Jesus himself on the cross, he says, he asks why God forsakes him.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to, I think an interesting essay, and maybe it's contained in the other one. I don't know if I said this, but the other essay that this one is paired with typically is, and I think we should do this one day, is called "Has a Man the Right to Let Himself to be Put to Death for Truth?" Mm-hmm. And maybe there's a question of where doubt fits into this story of the apostle, because we're not going to hear anything about doubt in this. Like I mean, it seems like Christ doubts in a way. I mean, is it? I don't know. Is that a doubt when Christ says, "Father, why have you forsaken me?"
I think. And we also have to think of him in the garden, kind of just wondering, wow, I'm going to die the most horrendous death. And should I go through with it? Should I not? I don't really know if he had doubt, but we can almost see and we read and we feel the agony that he felt when he was in the garden, like agony in the garden,
It also raises some really interesting questions that if Christ was actually part of the Trinity, why didn't he fully understand what he was about to experience?
I wonder if that's part of the incarnation or part man, where maybe he is of a worldly
then you start talking about maybe God having multiple minds, which is
another time.
A topic for another day. So I think we understand the difference between the genius and apostle enough. We've covered the sort of the three major breakdowns between them. I have some. I
don't know if we did though, because we didn't really talk about divine authority, did we?
Well, we're going to now.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. That was going to be the move that I was going to make. I did want to include a quote right before we started discussing divine authority.
Shoot.
I really like this quote, and I know you probably have a ton of quotes if you want to contribute anything, but this one on page 94 I really enjoyed. Whether the comparison is beautiful or whether it is worn and threadbare is all one. You must realize that what I say was entrusted to me by revelation. So what he's trying to say here is that in regards to the genius can be judged aesthetically or philosophically, and some individuals can be seen as being more of a genius than others, right? Like there are going to be some people who say, Luke is a crappy philosopher or Luke is an awesome philosopher. But when you're an apostle, you're an apostle. Like all that matters is if you're a messenger for the truth. It doesn't really matter how articulate you are in the expression of that truth.
And I think to give a context
St. Paul,
to give a context of that quote, it's Kierkegaard at least giving a sense of what an apostle would say to another person. And if you don't mind,
please.
I'll finish it.
Oh, you like that quote too, huh?
Whether the comparison, I do. So here's the full thing. Whether the comparison, so this is, again, imagine an apostle talking to a person about his message that he has to give. So he says, whether the comparison is beautiful or not, you must realize that what I say was entrusted to me by a revelation. Quote unquote, divine authority, like we were talking about, so that it is God himself or the Lord Jesus Christ who speaks. And you must not presumptuously set about criticizing the form. So I think what we're going to get at is that it's not the form or the content of the revelation of the doctrine, not the profundity, not the philosophical nitpicking, but the action of divine authority that gives it that weight. That isn't what Jesus says is so great, yay. It's the fact that he is God and man at the same time. And that's where it all
that's what it
begins.
ultimately comes down to. And Jesus said a lot of things that don't make sense to us. Like Jesus said, I'm going to butcher it here, but there's a passage in Luke, I believe, and Kierkegaard talks about this in Fear and Trembling, that it's like, you don't really love me unless you hate everyone else, unless you hate your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, your friends. Like, the only way to know if you really love me is if you would always choose me over them. And that's a hard thing to understand. Also, Jesus said things like, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to get into heaven. And that's a really hard thing for people to accept. And like, it's not always coherent with a lot of things that Jesus says in other contexts, like render unto Caesar what is Caesar, render what unto God what is God. Like, how do you square all these different utterances of Jesus? He didn't really Hegelize his thought process. And that's what Kierkegaard's trying to say, is that Jesus isn't a philosopher. Jesus, the truth incarnate.
Mhm.
And I thought was kind of interesting here on page 96, there's another quote that I liked, trying to understand the difference, like when trying to understand authority. He says, Kierkegaard, it says, authority is a specific quality which, coming from elsewhere, becomes qualitatively apparent when the content of the message or of the action is posited as indifferent. And he uses the example of two people who say, go, right? So like, if
a little kid tells you go.
Yeah. Like if I were to say to you, CJ, like, go, like, you wouldn't leave the room because I don't have any authority over you or whatever. But like, if a fireman rushes up here and he has a frenzied look in his eye and he says, go, like, you'd go because he has some sort of knowledge about your life and escaping from this house that's an inferno.
And what's very fascinating about that, fascinating is the adjective of the day, by the way. What's fascinating about that is what Kierkegaard uses as an example as well, where he says, if we want to use firefighter, I think he uses a police officer, but he says, no matter if the police officer is a saint or a sinner or whoever, or if he's a good guy, bad guy, once he puts on that uniform, he has authority. Yeah. So I think that goes back to the idea that apostleship isn't preceded by any kind of stroke of genius. There isn't this
There's no
build
way to
up.
know.
No, there's no imminence that comes from it. It's just you get the uniform randomly, regardless if you are a person persecuting Christians like Paul was. And we have to think of that, even St. Paul, who was essentially a bad guy.
Yeah.
Or even an Augustine, who was quite the philanderer himself. And then they got this call.
Yeah.
All of a sudden.
But they have this is the thing, there's no physical proof that you are an apostle with divine authority. There's no like God giving you a permission slip to espouse the truths of the gospel, whereas man's authority has badges and scepters and credentials and things like that, right? Like, you have in man's world, physical artifacts will indicate your authority. So like the fireman who comes up here dressed in his uniform or whatever, we give the authority to him. But if he retires and takes off that uniform, we realize that his authority was transitory. And precisely because the apostle doesn't have a physical thing to say, this is where my authority comes from, his authority is not transitory, whereas the authority of men lasts only for a short while.
And that's something that he does bring in when he's talking about the authority of a king, for instance, where he kind of says that thing where he mentions how, well, when a king dies and when a servant dies, they both become equal in the end. And he says, well, okay, let's take that with God, for instance. If God were to die and you were to die, that it's not, and to quote him, so that in eternity God and man, like king and servant, become equals. That's not what happens. God is forever the authority.
See, that passage sort of, I have to read that entire passage, because the way I thought that was kind of a provocative passage. I think I may even sort of tagged you in it on a Facebook post.
I did see that. Yeah, I think the thing with
the way I read it is like, I almost thought that Kierkegaard was saying, and I'll have to go back and recheck it, in that particular passage, it seemed to me to think that there was that things were made equal in eternity. It's kind of a minor point, so I don't want to confuse people
No, but
on
I think
it.
it was he did use the negative in that. I think when you quoted it in the book, which is fascinating, at least the negative part of it was on the prior page, I think, and then you just had the profound statement was just right there, and that's another fascinating little thing.
That leapt out at me.
But that's okay. But yeah, it's this idea that divine authority transcends uniform. It transcends.
It doesn't matter who you are.
No.
You can be a king. You can be a prosecutor you can be a tax collector. You can be a scoundrel. You can be a scholar. It doesn't matter. Whereas earthly authority, it matters very much in your station. But what's interesting about all this, we have to look at, where does the authority come from? It comes from this revelation where we're called, right? So like the ultimate, what is that revelation? It's Jesus and his words. So the individual, the apostle, gets his authority by how he encounters that revelation and then imitates that revelation and says what it is. So if you want to know, it seems like what he's saying, if you want to know if you have the divine authority, and if you're an apostle rather than a genius or an established person of society, is what you're saying comporting with the message of Jesus Christ?
Though I wonder if anybody can know whether they're an apostle or not. I think in the sense that there's this, not doubt, but there's this unease where you have to say, look, if you're talking to somebody and you can't really convince them via aesthetics, via philosophically, you can't use logic to say, well, listen to my sermon. And he does use a very interesting little quip where he says that maybe the apostle in that case becomes the examinee who appears on the market with a new teaching, as in the sense of like, okay, like you look over this and God and I are just going to sit outside and you tell us whether I'm an apostle or not. And you'll see if I was appointed by God. That there can't be any kind of,
I love that you remembered that. That's awesome.
There can't be any quote unquote rational understanding of whether somebody's an apostle or not.
Yeah,
it's not a marketplace thing.
The dissertation committee is like trying to decide, is this person an apostle or a genius? And meanwhile, they've like snuck into heaven, the apostle.
So I think that plays into that's another layer of the paradoxical side of the apostle, of the paradoxical religion, is that we can't prove it.
It can't be evaluated.
And like we were talking about in the present age, we can't know if the person is quote unquote victorious or whether they made it to the religious sphere or whether they are a quote unquote apostle. And I think he uses the extent that, you who hear Jesus Christ's words or an apostle's words must consider within yourselves whether you will bow before his authority, being the apostle or God's authority, or not. But please, by all means, please do not accept, and these are just my words, just please do not accept that this doctrine for aesthetic reasons. Please do not. That is the main thing, which is like, don't do it there. Just do it between your relation. I think what we're talking about, the individual existential relation. Do it between your relation with God and I on whether I can't really say believe, because believe is still within that kind of aesthetic genius talk. Do you think?
No, it's a different type of belief.
Okay,
you can have philosophical belief, and then you can have a faith belief. And the difference between, I think the reason why he doesn't want you to make the belief in Christ based on philosophy or aesthetics, on good paintings or renderings of Jesus and his beauty and how just gorgeous a man he was, or on how philosophically coherent the doctrine was or whatever, is that essentially if you base it on like church paintings and what the public believes in Copenhagen or in another time period, or on the philosophical thought or whatever, that your freedom will be compromised in that process. But if you make the leap of faith based on your relationship to the revelation that is Jesus Christ, your freedom is preserved, because the paradox can't be normalized. You have to make this decision for it, and you're not lured into it. You're lured into sin. You're lured into speculation. You're lured in. Jesus doesn't lure you. He says, stop. You can't think me. Now decide. And so there's no seduction of Christ for Kierkegaard, either philosophically or aesthetically.
And what I think is part of that, and maybe this plays into the doubt part of this discussion, is that in a portion of this text, he does mention doubt and superstition. He says, well, maybe those that doubt can't really come to grips with obedience and authority. That maybe the people that, we have those people. I'm one of them, and maybe a couple that say like, yeah, religion's good and all, but I don't really know.
I
don't know if
doubt. I'm
a
a Christian, but I still doubt, and so did Kierkegaard.
Right. Well, I mean those people that can't really say they are quote unquote Christian or not taking that leap of faith, in the sense that maybe like, oh, I'll use myself as a diagnosis. Sure. That, okay, I can't really say Jesus Christ is my savior, but I'm looking at it within the genius side, like, oh, it's all really profound and really makes sense, I guess, in that way. And the leap of faith, that's such a profound moment. That's really, really fascinating. That perhaps I think Kierkegaard is diagnosing that doubt and superstition as just being shy of authority, of being shy of that. Maybe that's what's getting in the way. Is us not accepting the divine authority, which is such a paradoxical thing that we're just
you can't put
right
aside
now.
the doubt. And Kierkegaard, I think probably, this is a question for another day, but Kierkegaard probably identified more with you more often, or felt more comfortable identifying with you, because I think he would say, these pseudonyms like Johann de Climacus or Johann Climacus, and Climacus could get he could understand Christianity as a thought doctrine, but he couldn't make the final movement. Or even you see it in Fear and Trembling as the pseudonym Johann de Silentio. He talks about how he can't get inside Abraham's mind, and he just marvels at him or whatever. I'd have to. I don't know of Johann de Silentio where he falls on that Christian-unchristian divide, but
that's interesting then, because he looks at Abraham as a quote unquote great man. So perhaps as a knight of faith. So I don't know if that's getting too far into the genius side, where maybe it is, maybe he's looking at it as an apostle, but perhaps he's kind of going, and maybe you'll discuss this on Friday when you do Fear and Trembling, but maybe he goes a little on the genius side, and maybe that's what Kierkegaard is showing, that you have these apostles, but you can't really idolize them as a quote unquote person, as, for their doctrines or for their actions. You just have to say, look, he has authority because of divine authority, and that I have to believe in God and have that relation with him to believe that the God that I am in relationship would give that person such authority.
I want to say a little
mind-boggling thing to.
I want to tease out this authority thing just a little bit more, because I think it was interesting. He says that he brings up Plato again here, and he says that Plato may say the same thing as an apostle. Like Plato, through secular reason, will say that there is an eternal life, and like the beggar who is an apostle may say there is an eternal life. But he says that Plato doesn't have the divine authority. He's kind of just said the same thing through his profundity. And what is kind of interesting about that, it's not necessarily the things that you say that make you an apostle, and you can even reach the same conclusion as an apostle through reason. But if there isn't the intercessor of Christ, if you don't have the encounter with Christ, it's the revelation, you are not an apostle. So you can even identify as a Christian, parrot the things of Christianity, but if you've not invited Christ into your heart, like, you still aren't an apostle. You're like a televangelist who go and then embezzles all the money out of the church offering.
That is one of the most jarring things about the paradoxical religion, is that content, in a sense, is thrown out the window.
Yeah. It's really, I mean, it is and it isn't. There is a permissible form of content, and the permissible form of content is to proclaim the same things that Jesus did. It's like you have to have that content plus the encounter with Jesus. If you take, if you Jeffersonian Bible it and take Jesus out, but retain that content or parts of that content, it seems like there's a minimal amount of content that has to be there plus the revelation within your heart of Jesus.
That is a great point, because I know Kierkegaard does use the example of Jesus and a theology student saying, oh, well, there is eternal life. Where he says the theology student, like, sure, he's got it right, but it's only because God told it through Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
That I think that's a really great point, is that you need both. But
Yeah.
then there's the really confusing part, or maybe not confusing, but frustrating part, where what if you don't have that
Which part?
connection with Jesus, where maybe you do believe it, but you haven't had that
You're not an apostle.
moment.
You don't really believe on Kierkegaard's view. You don't really have faith. If you
So
haven't
you
had
need that moment. So I guess
you know what's interesting? You say the moment is that Kierkegaard later in his authorship started a journal called The Moment. I believe I don't know if it's Danish or German. It's called Augenblick or something like that. And that's the divine encounter. And if you don't have it, then you're not an apostle. You're not a person of faith. You're not a knight of faith. Abraham has the Augenblick when he heeds the call from God to sacrifice Isaac. Now, what's interesting about Abraham, we'll talk about this in Fear and Trembling, and we'll talk about this throughout our other conversations, is, and this is a problem for Kierkegaard, is with Abraham, what religion was Abraham a part of? Was Abraham a Christian? No.
Abrahamic.
Abraham started it all. I mean, you could say that he was maybe like an animist or something like that, where he was just sacrificing animals to God or something. And then, Christ doesn't come on the scene for how many millennia? So the interesting thing is that it seems like, at least in the case with Abraham and maybe a few other people, it seems like only a handful of people really had faith prior to the revelation of Christ in time.
Yeah.
And then you start talking about, why did God allow for only a select few people prior to Jesus's birth to encounter the divine?
Yes, it's that Old Testament.
Yeah.
The whole entire Old Testament, I think, is maybe, and I know he does talk about Job, at least in repetition, we'll see. And of course, Abraham, just these people where we haven't had the incarnation, so it's really difficult to, and again, it goes back to the idea where we don't have an authority. We don't have anybody with a badge saying, yep,
yeah,
God's real. And maybe, this might sound crazy, Luke, but maybe Jesus was that badge sort of thing, where maybe we say like, okay, it's him, or maybe an apostle is almost kind of like having an invisible badge, where it's just,
that's, I wouldn't say that's necessarily a wrong thing to think. Like, we are to be the light in the world. We are to be this imitation. We are to be. It's just hard to say, because, that's a pretty big thing. There's an interesting passage in this text where Kierkegaard says you can't. There is no sort of evidence that you can marshal for your calling or for God in general, because God is spirit, and there's nothing, you can't use physical things to prove the spirit of God. This is the last quote I have, and maybe if you want to discuss some things, but I think we've covered all the big ideas in this comprehensive overview of this text. That he says on page 105, all the apostles can say is, I am called by God, and I make you eternally responsible for what you do against me.
Mm-hmm.
And which is really, there's another book that I maybe will cover one day called The Book of Adler, and Kierkegaard had to address this issue where someone, I believe in Denmark, maybe it was somewhere else, believed they were receiving new revelations. And so Kierkegaard had to determine whether or not this individual was actually an apostle or a crazy man or whatever else.
Do you know how he diagnosed it? Maybe if you can give it just... I don't
remember.
Yeah.
His name was Adler, and he ultimately ended up recanting and saying that, like maybe it was just inspiration or something like that.
Stroke of genius.
The stroke of genius. And it's kind of a continuation of this. I guess we know what we're going to eventually cover, but he takes up this, because the question then becomes, well, what if someone says more than Jesus is God, there's an eternal life, I hold your eternal. What if someone starts saying, oh yeah, by the way, like in addition to all of that, he gave me these tablets and we're going to start a new religion called Mormonism. Or in addition to all of that, like he also said that Hegel got stuff right. Like if you add on any content beyond this sort of minimal threshold of content, what happens? And was that person originally an apostle and then they went crazy? Did they mix their genius with their apostle? Did they get seduced by philosophy or some lower existence stage? Kierkegaard will take that up in this book of Adler.
So that gets right to the point of where's the line between heresy and divine authority? Or maybe we think of like a Luther, and I'm pretty sure Kierkegaard would agree that maybe a Luther is an apostle because he did something that was so paradoxical. Even the hard part about Luther is that it was assimilated into Lutheran practices and whatnot. So I don't know if that necessarily is.
It is, but
it is and it isn't at the same time.
It is, but at the heart of what Luther is saying is that, you know, Jesus is God, and that will never be assimilated. If it's properly understood as offensive, then Luther will remain the apostle and have his paradoxical relationship.
Okay. But, yeah, maybe that was a point I wanted to maybe bring up too, is assimilation within a religion, as in like Christianity, where you have Christians, and whether that is assimilation or whether that is, if we go back to the one big idea, whether that is a bunch of individuals who have had that, not saying they're all apostles, but they've had that experience or that relationship with God to accept the divine authority of Jesus Christ and of the apostles and of whoever else, whether it be Luther, and then take that and, okay, we're all a bunch of individuals within a church.
Yeah.
Is that a fair
I think
assessment?
I think what he's really concerned, and he's really concerned about saving Christendom from itself. I think what he's concerned about is that, you know, I think he would be just astonished at like these mega churches that we have in America today, and people throwing their hands up and like singing these corny ass like Christian rock songs and stuff like that. Like I think he would have a big problem with that because he would wonder if people have really encountered Christ or if they're just giving into this normalized cultural movement that says you have to look and act a certain way. Mm-hmm. And look, I think there's some basis for concern about that because you know, look at all the things that go wrong in these church communities. Like, you know, would you have people committing such egregious sins and also claiming to be Christians simultaneously? Like if this was really an effective route to encounter the paradox that is Christ, would all these things really be going on within the church?
And that's another really interesting point, because then we bring in the idea of aesthetics getting thrown in there. Like you said, mega church, where it's all about big, big, big. And there's light shows and acoustic and electric guitars and
drum solos
and, you know, lapel mics and all of these crazy
PowerPoints.
things. Yeah, PowerPoints.
Skits.
Right. So whether in a sense
he would have keeled over, man.
Yeah,
he would have hated it so much.
That is just maybe so much aesthetic and not any of the paradox religion. And you're going to explore that, and you're going to explore that in Fear and Trembling too, where he takes the story of Abraham.
Like why don't I go to church?
Mm-hmm.
Why don't I go to church? Because the sermons that are popular in American church right now are like, how can Jesus help you balance your checkbook? Or like,
sure, it's like functional fitness, but it's functional religion. Yeah, right?
It's like, how can Jesus help you with your love life or something like that? It's like one big Dr. Phil episode. It doesn't problematize the Christian religion. It doesn't challenge me.
Well, that's a really great point too, is that we have this convergence of self-help and religion, which is really, really crazy, because we have somebody saying, oh, you're special, you're one of a kind, that you need to just put in the work ethic and God's going to help you and it's going to be great. When maybe it's not. When you have a guy like Job or a guy like Abraham, where it's just like, and maybe some, you're going to have some guys like, sometimes like God's going to have you kill your son and you have to do it. Yeah, nobody says that.
Yeah, Jesus was martyred. or not, maybe martyred isn't the right word, but Jesus was sacrificed for humanity. And it very may well be the case, if you're truly a Christian, that you will be sacrificed too. It's not going to be all roses to be a Christian. And in fact, if you're doing it the right way, you will experience suffering. Like, for instance, like, I'm probably going to take S for confessing that I'm a Christian on this thing. Like, there are probably going to be a lot of people who, like, Luke doesn't do serious philosophy because he's a Christian. Or like Luke, or maybe evangelicals will be like, did you hear how he talk crap about the mega church? I could get it from all sides, you know?
Arthur Schopenhauer, talking about Christianity, mentioned the idea of the symbol of Christianity being the cross, and how, if I can use this term in a right way, profound and jarring and just insane that is. That the image of the religion is a torture device.
Yeah.
And one of the most egregious and painful and sadistic.
Yeah, Nietzsche and Schopenhauer are going to have a field day with that. Yeah.
All time. I would say of all time.
Yeah, I can't imagine a worse death.
It's like a marathon execution. That's how I kind of look at it, where you're like 25 miles.
Maybe
of
Wes
pain and
Craven
agony.
or somebody has thought of something more ingenious than that torture device.
Perhaps.
That's pretty terrible.
No, and just having that as your symbol, maybe people like Nietzsche or Schopenhauer, dare I say Kierkegaard, to throw him into the geniuses. But I think those guys, or at least what we're getting at here, is we are finding it's interesting. I don't want to say the profundity. I love the word profound.
It's profound in a different way.
I think we're getting the paradox religion part of it. That there is this agony and absurdity to it that perhaps, like we said, these self-help mega churches aren't really getting at. That
they're actually doing a disservice to Christianity on Kierkegaard's view.
Right. And I think reading Kierkegaard today is a way to actually get at the leap. I mean, we always say leap of faith, but I think Kierkegaard, especially in this text and maybe in the present age, and like we'll see in Fear and Trembling and the other works we're going to explore, the existential individual, that big idea, that the leap of faith is this really scary, absurd, and wild thing that is needed in order to claim to even be a Christian. That it is a lot of work. And I think that is what we keep bringing up, and what you always tell me is that Kierkegaard is all about it being a ton of work, and you're not really sure if you even make it at the end, which is the crazy part. And he didn't even know he was a Christian at the end, or whether he's like, am I really a Christian?
Isn't there some passage that, like, it's like, if I were to find out, like, if everybody else had gone to heaven and I was in hell, I would still say God's justice was served. was that in this book, or was that another one?
I think it was another one.
Yeah,
you did send that to me as well.
He's like, and people will say to me, like, Luke, you're a Christian just because, like, you want to go to heaven one day. I don't think about heaven at all. I just try to get through each day, each moment, so I don't off myself. Like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, it doesn't really matter to me if there isn't. It doesn't even matter to me if there is an afterlife. Like, if God doesn't want me to go to heaven, or puts me in purgatory or hell or something like that, like, so be it. Like, I can't control that, and I'm not even going to try to control at all. The reason why I'm a Christian is because it helps me live here. Mm-hmm. And I'm not really, anything beyond that is like totally house money, man. Like, if I just die and rot in the ground and that's like all she wrote, like, I'm cool with that. But like, if I live on and get to play with my childhood pets and hang out with my grandma again, like, that's cool too, but I'm not fantasizing about it. I play ping pong with Benjamin Franklin, right? and form a band with Jimi Hendrix, right? Like, yeah, that'd be pretty awesome. But that's to think of, if we start thinking about heaven, we're starting to think about...
We're thinking about it aesthetically.
We start to think about religion aesthetically. Yeah, and that's not what Kierkegaard wants to encourage.
And if I could get meta for a second,
Please.
somebody reading Kierkegaard, I know I had a friend who was in seminary and did all that. I was kind of having many moments of doubts, and he
Sure.
said, "Well, you should read Kierkegaard." And I'm sure you've referenced Kierkegaard to a lot of people, and I wonder if we are recommending him in the sense of genius, or in the sense of literary, in the sense that, well, he's going to say a lot of profound things, and he's a great writer, and he's just going to make you believe in Jesus Christ, and he's going to make you think about religion differently. Is that our agenda here, even with Noetic? Are we trying to say, hey, look at the genius of Soren Kierkegaard and how great he is? Or are we maybe just trying to show how Kierkegaard is saying, hey, this is the condition of a paradoxical religion. You can take it or leave it, but please do not accept me on the terms that I make a good argument or that my prose is pretty.
Yeah, I think that's...
Is it maybe the former rather than the latter? I mean, because I don't even know how you got into Kierkegaard originally.
It was I got into Kierkegaard accidentally. Like, I got into making this app and this website accidentally. I was doing a dissertation originally looking at how Kant, Kierkegaard, and Hegel all embrace Christianity, but through their own weird ways. Like, Kant ends up postulating Christianity as part of his moral project. A lot of people, and Hegel, a lot of people read Hegel as a weird Christian. And then Kierkegaard, we've been talking a lot about how Kierkegaard views the approach to Christianity, that it's like this intellectually unresolvable leap that you have to make. And I was totally prepared to do that dissertation project. And then I was told that that was too ambitious of a dissertation project, and I had to cut it down by 2/3. So I had to cut out 2 of the 3 thinkers that were involved in it. And I thought about it, and I was like, well, do I want to study Hegel? Do I want to study Kant? Or do I want to study Kierkegaard? And when I really thought about it, I could think of Kierkegaard seemed to be the only one that actually really believed in Christianity. Like, I could see that Kant sort of grafted Christianity onto his thought, maybe for political reasons. And Hegel was so obscure about his commitment to Christianity that I couldn't really tell if he believed in it or if he believed that he was the new religion or whatever. So I didn't know what I thought about Kierkegaard's philosophy and Christianity in general, but I knew he meant what he said. I knew he really believed it. And I was like, well, if I'm going to spend X amount of years of my life studying a philosopher, it'd probably be best to study the one that actually believed what he said.
That is wonderful, because I think what you're getting at is that, okay, Hegel and Kant, they looked at Christianity in the aesthetic way, in the philosophical way, in the sense of, okay, let's draft a system.
Yes.
While Kierkegaard said, no, let's just get rid of the system and stare at the abyss that is the paradoxical religion, that is the leap of faith, that it is a existential thing.
Yeah.
It isn't pretty wine and roses. Hey, I'm a Christian now. It is look into the abyss. This is what I mean. I'm not trying to give it in a negative light, but in the sense like it's a leap of faith,
right?
In the truest sense of the term, which is, I think we use that term so many times and like, oh, it's a leap of faith, but I think Kierkegaard is telling us like, look at how insane.
It's totally insane.
And absurd this is.
It's not rational.
No.
It's not rational philosophically. But you could make the case. You could make the case, and we'll explore this at a different time. We should probably wind this down. But you could make the case that it's rational on a subjective level, in the sense that like for instance, like, why will I not give up Christianity now? Right now that I'm converted to the perspective. Well, it would be irrational after I know how effective it is at driving out so much sin in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it remains irrational on a philosophical perspective, but I know how much it heals me, and to give up on the thing that heals me would be a different type of irrationality. So it's both rational and irrational. Right. It's irrational
I suppose it heals you, but it doesn't always, which is, I think, the point too. Well, maybe it heals you in the long run. But like a Job or an Abraham, where you have these moments where it's just like kind of like, oh,
yeah. I think we have to we have to have a conversation about what it means to be healed, because sometimes a medicine can be toxic at the same time. Like in order to kill cancer, you have to take drugs that make you very sick.
Sick unto death.
Yeah. Well, but Christianity might be like that. It might be the thing that ultimately saves our life, but it may make us sick in the process. And, people like Nietzsche have pointed out the sickness that it can bring, in terms of guilt and perversion of values, at least from his perspective. That's what he thinks happens. But you ask yourself, do you want that cure? And I know the thing is, Luke 8 years ago would have not been interested in that, but Luke now is interested in that. And you really can't, like, for instance, you say you're not a person of faith. There's nothing I can say, and I don't really want to. It's not my job. There's nothing I can say like, CJ, you really ought to be a Christian. It's so much better. The only way you'll know that it's better is if you make the movement of faith for yourself and then test your life before and after it.
Yeah.
That's the only way I can't show you the difference. I can't do it for you. So you kind of have to use yourself as the laboratory. And that's kind of cool. Like,
it's an experiment, but not in an aesthetic sense, not in the sense of, I get to try, but it's like, leap.
This is what it is. And, take it or leave it.
And I think what's reassuring, at least with Kierkegaard, is that, like you said, he wasn't even sure if he was a complete Christian. And I think that is, if I can take from Simone de Beauvoir, that Christianity or being a Christian might just be process. It is
a process.
It is not
you never arrive.
You never arrive.
You know why you can't arrive?
Why?
Because the truth is Christ, and we can't be Christ. We can only approach Christ,
but
in
never
this life,
reach him.
But we can never reach him. We can never become Christ.
That infinity between 1 and a million.
Yeah.
We cannot.
We can get very close, but we can never become the truth. The best we can do is have a subjectively true relationship to the truth. But Christ is the pure truth.
And jumping into that abyss, I think, like Kierkegaard has said before, where you have to go into hell to find your beloved. You have to just take that leap and all of the baggage that comes with it. It's not pretty.
No.
It's not easy. It's difficult. But through the process, you have that relationship with God, and that is the really, I don't want to use the word profound. I'm trying to figure out another word, but that is the thing about the paradoxical religion, is that in loss you gain something. I think maybe if we just keep using paradoxical,
or if you have the right gain, if you have the right encounter, then you're willing to endure all the losses. You're willing to endure what Job lost. You're willing to endure what Abraham could have lost. You're willing to go through the pilgrimage that Christ went through. I mean,
and
I think you're willing to. Yeah. I guess the thing is like the suffering, what you get from the relationship to God outweighs the suffering that you incur. Yeah. And what's strange about this is that there are easier routes in life. Like, it's probably easier to be an aesthete. It's probably easier to be an ethical person, but you're also probably there's a certain suffering that goes along with that ultimately leads in a lot of suicide and addiction and a lot of problems. So,
but we can't say, okay, therefore, if you do not want to go that way, you should go to Jesus Christ, because we can't use that's the paradoxical part. That's where it's just like every kind of thing where it's just like, oh, it's process. Oh, that's really cool. I should definitely be a Christian now. Like, to Kierkegaard, that'd just be like, no. Don't use that aesthetic talk, that philosophical talk.
You know what's strange though? I think there might be a bit of Kierkegaard might articulate a bit of a proof for the existence of God through the sickness unto death by detailing all the different types of despair that are epidemic in the existential stages, except for when you're in faith.
Mm.
And I think so that'll be an issue we have to take up another day. We're probably scattershotting all these ideas of Kierkegaard. Probably, I think I'm pretty comfortable bringing this to a close. But is there anything else you wanted to say?
It's just a really, I want to say this with all the love that I can, but it's a frustrating, Kierkegaard is a frustrating philosopher,
That's the
a
point.
frustrating thinker, and that's the whole point.
He wants to mess with you.
He's the monkey wrench with all of these things, and I think he's great for our present age because, I mean, just like in the beginning where I was talking about the profundity of the paradoxical relationship, we are so, at least I don't know if you would agree with this, I'm pretty sure you would, but we are so within the philosophical and aesthetic world, especially when we think about Christianity today, like we were saying, mega churches, even Bible, I would dare say some Bible studies, or just trying to market Christianity, make it into a business, and the difference between philosophy and religion, and that sort of thing where it's like, oh, a smart person would never do that. Or even the sense of Pascal's wager, where it's just like, well, like better to believe that than nothing, where it's these things that are so ingrained within the aesthetic and the philosophical, where Kierkegaard is the monkey wrench in all of that, to have to make us, I don't know if the word is think, but to really mull over what we're dealing with. We're dealing with an existential, paradoxical religion that is Christianity. And I think that's his big idea, or at least the individual. That's the big idea.
He doesn't want us to think for the sake of thinking. He wants us to think so that we wager more on the belief. So he wants to make this harder for you, CJ, so that when you do accept it, you experience greater joy. Because if you don't think about it, you either get lulled into cultural Christianity and you don't really experience the true joy of faith, or you experience sickness and despair and sin because the threshold wasn't set high enough for you to experiencing the offsetting enjoyment of union with Christ. So I don't know. It'll mess with you.
It will, because
it's messing with me a little bit right now. I mean,
it is because any kind of, it's almost like a chess match where anything you do, it's kind of like, oh, nope, checkmate, you lose. Because I'm trying to even think right now, even in the sense of like, well, okay, maybe it's better if I do this. But maybe I'm kind of looking at it you're
making a calculation.
I'm making a calculation about it. And it's like, back to square one.
I think
that didn't work.
I think the only way that the only way process that I could really endorse this is like, I encounter a lot of really sad people, and I think we're all sad, and I think Kierkegaard recognizes we're all sad. And I've worked in the field of suicide prevention. I care deeply about that issue, and I think when one accepts what Kierkegaard is saying is when you've exhausted every other option. You've turned with all the levels of aesthetical life, sex, art, music, philosophy. It fails you. You've turned to every aspect of the ethical life. You've tried to be a good person and save the world and realize you can't, and you fail. You try to be a nominally religious person and have like a general sort of conception of God, but it doesn't speak to your person. It's kind of this distant God, this vanishing point, and it fails. And I think the way Kierkegaard is saying, what's left standing? What do you have to lose? Why don't you try Christianity now? Everything else.
But it's not that at the same time. Or it's like you can't be like enjoying Christianity now.
He can't come out and say it, because if he does say it like that, it reduces it to a simple formula. And that's why he has to use the pseudonyms and indirect communication, because he wants you to live out these different views and experience their limitations, so you make the decision for yourself. Man, like, I don't want to do this Christian thing. I'm going to fight it every step of the way. And then you're just like, I'm either going to kill myself or I'm going to accept this truth.
But that's a really profound part even of the pseudonyms, is that they're almost like journals, because we know Kierkegaard was an aesthete. He went to plays. He has very detailed accounts
you don't
of
disavow-
Don
you-
Giovanni and of certain actors and productions. He knows what he's talking about in that regards. And
you don't give up on those things when you become
No.
a Christian. They just get they're
marginalized,
they just get redeemed, right? They just mean something different. You can still be an artist and be a Christian. You can still be an ethicist and be a Christian. It's just they don't have the priority that they had before.
Yeah, because I was thinking
you can still like love a woman, but she's not your goddess.
no.
Yeah, she just there's God that comes in between you and the woman. Whereas like if you don't have that triangulation, the woman becomes your God, or music becomes your God, or ethics becomes your God. And Kierkegaard's trying to say, no, Christ is God, and then everything else is in relation to it.
That's a fantastic point. And that was something I was even thinking of right now when you're talking about music. When I think we had an earlier conversation, I think another podcast, I think we were talking about obscurity, maybe, or the virtue of obscurity, and how we were saying that I think at the end you made the notion that, well, look, Kierkegaard says no matter how much of a failure you are, or he doesn't say this, but what we're implying here is that no matter how much of a failure you are in music or in any other endeavor, if you have that paradoxical relationship with God, that's all that matters. And the thing about that is that I want to use that, but in a sense, that's also a crutch too, which is just saying like, okay, well, CJ, if you're not really good at anything, like there's God, it's cool. So that's another crutch. That's another thing that's kind of thrown to the side. So we're just kind of left, like you said, I think with just exhausting all these options until we're just, like throw our hands in the air, where maybe that is a revelation, or that is a kind of divine moment where God comes into our life, or I guess we have, to use Simone de Beauvoir to kind of appropriate her in this conversation, we have this existential full disclosure of our being, and that we become a Christian.
Yeah. And the thing is, I mean, just because I'm a Christian doesn't mean that I don't care for this world.
No.
You have to look at Abraham and other people and how we're supposed to, Abraham's supposed to be an example for how we're supposed to be a knight. Abraham doesn't know what the outcome of the situation is. He trusts by virtue of the absurd that he will get Isaac back and be blessed and happy.
He loved his son.
He had to love God and Isaac at the same time and go through the sacrifice. But you have to be prepared to receive this world back with receptivity. And I just because you become a Christian and rely on that crutch or whatever doesn't mean that you stop loving the world. You don't stop loving Isaac. You don't stop loving people. You don't stop loving your wife. You don't stop loving music. You just perhaps love it in a different way. And it's not like we're supposed to give up on life once we make the movement. That's what the Knight of Infinite Resignation does. They withdraw from the world and just wait to die, right? But the Knight of Faith, the person really committed to Christ, puts their arms back around the world regardless of what's stripped away from them.
And that sounds really great. And maybe I'm thinking of it as a profound statement, and maybe that's my problem.
In fact, Kierkegaard may make the argument that you got to stop all this thinking and all this and be more involved in the world. Hence why Kierkegaard is the father of existentialism. You have to exist. Stop thinking so much. Right? Like get to it. Like make it happen. Like make stuff happen. Like doing what we're doing right here. We're making it happen.
And we're getting really into the we're getting really into the paradoxical religion.
Yeah, right.
We are stumbling. I think that's the greatest part about this, is that I'm stumbling, you're stumbling. We're both kind of like, okay, maybe that isn't it either. And maybe that's part of it.
Yeah. And look, we should stumble because the thing is, we're ultimately talking about spiritual matters that can't really be put into words entirely.
Yeah.
And that's why Kierkegaard is against Hegel, because he thinks that the religious consciousness or the subjectivity of the individual cannot be reduced to a sentence. And therefore you have an incomplete system. And to talk about an incomplete system is like talking about like a semicircle, like it's a circle.
Or like
If there's
you're dancing about architecture, right?
Yeah.
Like that great Zappa quote where he's like, oh, like music, talking about music or writing about music, that's just like dancing about architecture. It doesn't really give the
no.
essence
There will
of
be
this.
there will be a fundamental aspect that will remain private and can never be reduced to a science.
Well, that's the really interesting thing about maybe Kierkegaard as a writer, as a philosopher, is that in doing that, maybe he is a martyr in that way, is that he has taken up this cross of trying to actually articulate it within these kind of pseudonyms and within these different views, is that maybe he is a martyr in that sense, is that he's doing this thing that like it's not gonna happen, and this is his cross that he has to bear.
This is his cross. It's crazy. We all got our crosses, man.
Let's end there.
Yeah.
That just kind of blew my mind for a second.
All right, guys, download the Noetic app. This I don't know. This goes without saying. This is a Noetic recording, copyright 2016. Don't steal it. And next time I think we'll be doing some Fear and Trembling, and maybe we'll do some more Kierkegaard, or maybe we'll do my dissertation. We'll figure it out. Bro. All right, see you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.